Welcome to the Classical Gabfest, a weekly discussion about the ever-changing world of classical music. I'm your host for this week, Kensho Watanabe, and with me as always are Tiffany Liu and William White. This week we'll start by sharing our favorite COVID-era success stories from the world of classical music. Then we'll discuss the first two chapters of Alex Ross's Wagnerism as part of our ongoing book club. And finally, we'll debate the pros and cons of completely blind orchestral auditions. But first, we'd like to start with our prelude segment. So Tiffany, what do we have today?
This week, we'll be playing a round of everyone's favorite game, Stump the Hosts, aka Name That Tune.
And now Free Zone presents Name That Tune.
Music games don't come any simpler and any more intimidating than Name That Tune. And for us, this game is especially fraught because none of the three of us know what we're about to hear. That's because these Name That Tune submissions come from you, our loyal listeners. We make no guarantee that we'll be able to identify precisely what these pieces are, but we hope that hearing our thought processes will elucidate something about how we listen to music and provide some entertaining musical banter, of course. Since none of us knows what's coming, we've asked our official podcast intern, Joseph Vaz, to play the excerpts for us and reveal the answers. Joseph is a master's degree student in piano performance at the Cincinnati College Conservatory of Music and a former youth orchestra student of Wills. Thanks so much for helping us today, Joey.
You're very welcome. It's my pleasure.
All right. Shall we do our first excerpt here?
Okay, here's our first clip. This comes from listener Marcello.
That's where it cuts off?
That was super intense. I mean, obviously a full orchestra at full tilt. You know, I think that's something that we're going to be listening for in here is the palette of instruments and colors, you know, because that, especially in orchestral context, that'll give us a lot of clues to at least narrow down the date and in some cases the nationality and the style.
I'm also listening for the harmony because when it first started, I thought it might have some characteristics of like maybe something that even approached like the minimalist or like just the way that it didn't move around for a long time. But then, of course, as the harmonic progressions went on, I was like, oh, this has got to be much earlier than that. Like we're talking pretty nice romantic chord progression, but with a maybe turn of the century palette of orchestral colors.
You know, with all the instrumentation, like, you know, you could tell the entire orchestra was playing. There was some brass involved and all this. And I was like, oh, like maybe like Tchaikovsky, like ballet music or something like that. But then the way it was amping up toward the end, I was like, okay, maybe this is something different. But I was going around that. I don't know, something about it struck me as kind of ballet music or music for the theater in some way.
My first guess was Berlioz, to be quite honest. That's like what immediately came to mind, just the frenzied nature of it. And I agree with both of you guys that there was something dramatic about it that seemed to suggest a theatrical setting. So I'll go ahead and put my first guess on the line. I think that this might be part of Berlioz' Les Troyens. The opera, The Trojans by Berlioz.
You're really going for it. I mean, that's like pretty specific.
Kensho's going to hop right on Will's bandwagon.
I'm all about that. If you know my strategy from all these games, I always go strengthen numbers.
I mean, another person that comes to mind maybe with the bombast of it is Saint-Saëns. I feel like there's that kind of the bacchanalia of it that speaks a little bit to that. So I think I'm going to throw my hat with Saint-Saëns, but although I do not have a particular work that I'm able to name. Okay, so we're ready for the answer, Joseph. I'm so curious.
Well, end of the 19th century was correct. Theatrical excess was also correct. However, you all had the country wrong. This was from Verdi's opera Falstaff.
All right. Why?
The opening of Act 3, Scene 1.
Of course, Marcello would give us a Verdi excerpt.
Thanks, Marcello.
Thanks, Marcello. He stumped us. Listeners 1, hosts 0.
How about the next one here?
This is our second clip. This comes from listener Jeremy.
super cool. I want to hear that rest of the piece now. I love that. So, I mean, let's place this safely in the 20th century. And initially I was like, oh, maybe Bartók, but then I think it went off another direction that I don't think is Bartók at all. Sounds like an ensemble that has some winds and strings in it. Did I hear any piano in there or no?
I don't think so.
To me, this is either a clarinet quartet, so like clarinet, violin, viola, cello, or a clarinet quintet. And there's more repertoire out there for a clarinet quintet, which would be clarinet plus your regular string quartet, 2 violins, viola, and cello. I definitely agree with Kensho that we're squarely in the modern period of the 20th century.
Well, Kensho, I'm interested in hearing like your first Bartók, because that was where I went too. And what was the point that you were like, no, that's not Bartók?
Where it became quite pointillistic in a way, where there was just like lots of tiny fragments being kind of strewn about, where it's interesting because there is like a Hungarian element in the rhythm, because it's always da 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 da, which is like the classic, like what we like imagine like Hungarian rhythms to be, where there's like emphasis on the first shorter note value followed by a longer one. So that's where I was like, oh, okay. But then I think the way in which it was being kind of thrown about so many different sections, it didn't seem to me like it was Bartók, and it wasn't really melodic, which I think Bartók is known for, this folk music vibe that has a little bit more kind of thematic or melodic elements in the music that I didn't really necessarily hear this time.
Will, what do you think?
Okay, I really like Kensho's thought process, actually. I mean, I might jump on the bandwagon here with him.
No, the bandwagon has no horse at this point. It's not going anywhere.
Like, what's the bandwagon? It's not Bartók?
The bandwagon is Hungarian, I think.
Okay.
You know, I like his read that this has a Hungarian sound. I love how he alluded to that first accented short note as being characteristic. That's a characteristic of the Hungarian language. The accented syllable of almost every word in Hungarian is the first syllable. So that's why we think of Hungarian music as having that characteristic. I think that this is later in the 20th century than Bartók, who died around 1945. So I'm going to think that this is more from like the 1950s or 60s. I'm just going to go ahead and put a name on it. My guess is going to be György Kortag, who's a later 20th century composer, really into the 21st. I mean, I think he only died recently. Tiff, where are you at with this?
I think that was where I was going to go too. I mean, the only other like Hungarian composers that come to mind right now in that time slice are like Ligeti, which is like not quite where I'm thinking I want to go there.
And Kortag wrote a lot of wind music too, right? So that kind of does make sense. Wind and horn stuff, I think, quite often. So I don't know. I mean, yeah, sure, why not?
All right, well, we're all in agreement. The chances are very high that then we're all totally wrong.
Yeah.
All right, Joseph, let us have it.
All right. Well, this is a second half of the 20th century clarinet quintet. This is from the first movement of Elizabeth McConkey's clarinet quintet. She was an Irish-English composer.
There is no chance that we would have gotten that.
No, not at all.
All right, here will be our last clip for today. This comes from listener Eric.
Forget 30 seconds. Let's do 30 minutes next time.
I mean, for me, it was hitting like a very movie music vibe, actually.
Me too. That was exactly what I thought first too, Tiffany. Very film score energy in that.
Yeah, and so for that, obviously, we're talking about 20th century, but like the harmonic language is not particularly what we would think of as like avant-garde or
the harmonic language was like, I mean, I would think of it as being like a Max Steiner or, one of these film music composers of like the 30s and 40s.
Why did it hit such a film music aspect for us? I think that's like kind of interesting, right? Because the fact that it was the same motive, right? The same shape. There's a high pitch, ba-dum, and then there's a descending bass stuff, ba-da-dum. And the fact that relentlessly carried on the way it was made me feel as if there must be something else that you're supposed to be paying attention to, because that in and of itself was not leading me to sort of any
there was no melody to hang on to. There was no real architecture to follow in terms of the music itself.
Yeah, there was no music for its own sake. Well, the other place I kind of went was maybe opera. It feels like an operatic transition to me. But again, that's like sort of the precursor to movie music, right?
I think that my guess is going to be like a Max Steiner Miklos Rozsa's score circa 1935 to 1945.
Let's see. I mean, in the terms of the darkness, the kind of suspense, it could be like on the vein of like Hitchcock, Bernard Herrmann, maybe.
Cool. Okay. Joseph, give it to us.
All right. You all were there immediately with the film score thought. And I think that Kensho wins the game because this is an excerpt from Bernard Herrmann's score to Hitchcock's 1959 film North by Northwest.
Whoa! We got Kensho.
Oh, man.
I have to say, this is my first ever win on a CGF game here. So
I thought that we were all playing this together. I thought it was the listeners against us.
Our official intern, Joey, just said that I am the official winner. So I think it is now cemented.
Thanks so much for doing our assist today, Joseph. It's been great having you on the show, and we'll hope to hear you again at some later point. That just about does it for this week's Prelude segment. Before we wrap up, if you'd like to see if you can stump us, check our show notes, where you'll find a link to the form where you can upload a 30-second unidentified piece of classical music for us to try to identify the next time we play Name That Tune. And with that, we move on to our first topic. Will, what do you have for us?
The prospects for classical music can seem pretty bleak amid the current COVID crisis, particularly in the U.S. The New York Philharmonic and the Metropolitan Opera both recently canceled their entire 2021 seasons. This came after many smaller institutions had already done the same. Only a handful of concert halls in the United States allow for any audience members to be in attendance at all. And yet, like weeds peeking out of a concrete sidewalk, musicians are finding ways to carry on. So with that in mind, this week we each wanted to share an example of a COVID-era success story, an example of how our colleagues are using their creativity and ingenuity to share their art with the world. Kensho, let's start with you. What do you have for us today?
I wanted to bring to attention an opera company in New York called the Heartbeat Opera. And they've been in existence for a number of years now, and they've been presenting original adaptations of major operatic works in some creative spaces all around the city. And the co-artistic directors, Louisa Prosk and Ethan Hurd, reimagined these works by rearranging the order of the material and cutting scenes to kind of recontextualize the stories of each opera to make them more relevant and reflective of current times. And a friend of mine from college, actually, co-music director and arranger Daniel Schlossberg, creates new arrangements of these scores for a smaller group of instrumentalists. So this is really kind of a modern opera group that's very flexible and is able to kind of turn on a dime and kind of be successful in these times where people need to improvise and make do with what they have. So they're really well set up for all of this. And so in the spring of 2020, Heartbeat Opera was set to present Lady M, a 90-minute fantasia on Verdi's Macbeth from the perspective of Lady Macbeth. And that was going to be presented live at the Experimental Media and Performing Arts Center in Troy, New York, before the pandemic hit. To adjust to the times, they quickly converted their performances to virtual soirees on Zoom. And in that soiree, they would present two video projects. One was a short documentary of a behind-the-scenes look at their remote residency, where they really came up with these plans, and also a music video of Lady M's sleepwalking scene sung by soprano Felicia Moore.
So it sounds like this is an example of something that combines pre-recorded content with a live in-person Zoom streaming. Is that correct to characterize it as?
So I think they have some pre-recorded elements as part of the performance, and I think they also include some aspect of live performance, probably not an ensemble, but maybe one singer performing over Zoom live for an audience.
I love seeing a lot of things that have happened with opera. I mean, particularly as we know that like a lot of opera festivals occur during the summer, so they were having to reconfigure right at the time where it was very clear that we would have no semblance of a season. And I think opera is one of these genres that actually converts pretty well into mashups of modalities, we'll say. So like the combination of like a virtual choir project with something that gets streamed is very cool and able to be crowdsourced. And I think like there have been a lot of very cool opera projects this summer.
For more information about Heartbeat Opera, we'll include a link in our show notes.
Kensho, thanks so much for bringing that to our attention. It's great to see something from the world of opera. Tiffany, what do you have for us?
I'd like to bring to the spotlight a platform called GroupMuse, and this will be familiar, I think, to a lot of you who live in urban areas, because it is a platform that pre-existed COVID. And the premise was, of course, that we have this aesthetic of chamber music that we want to bring into our homes as kind of enjoyers of, something that would be lovely to host a gathering around. And as a platform, they have a number of rules that guide performances that allow folks to enjoy them in their homes the same way that we imagine that they were originally intended for when they were written, these works of chamber music, but in a way that kind of features the music itself. So it's not like groups sign onto this platform to be background music to a dinner party. So this platform pre-existed COVID. And now what they've done is they pivoted, of course, to a virtual concert format, which has, to some degree, ameliorated what I thought of as the only real drawback to that platform in the first place, which is that it is limited to geographical areas with a certain population density. So what they advertise right now is you can put together or enjoy 2 25-minute sets of, quote, mind-blowing music performed by professionals, and there is an audition or like a screening process associated with this. So it's not just that anyone can sign up to perform Suzuki Book 2 for their family. And then you can engage. They build in engagement sessions with the musicians directly before and after each of the concerts so that there's actually the same sort of dialogue that would go on were this a live event. Their website states that they've organized 344 virtual concerts since March with an average pay of $325 per player, which they charge a $10 minimum for the tickets. And of course, at this point, they are virtual tickets. But to know that you can support what it does amount to, I think, a grassroots approach to chamber music is really cool in this time where I think a lot of folks are reduced to performing chamber music for free, mostly because you're just wanting to get in touch with your audience and say that we're still here and we're still playing music, but we'd rather get back to doing the other thing. And so this is a cool format that I actually think can and should outlast the pandemic.
I thought it was really interesting that you mentioned that, the average musician is earning $325 for each of these gigs. Do you have any sense of how that would compare to what they were making from the house concerts that they were doing before the pandemic?
The kinds of players who might end up actually doing normal house concerts on the pre-COVID era GroupMuse, I don't think would probably be making this much, quite honestly. Like if you think about a quartet or even a trio generating $10 a pop, I don't know. I don't know what the arithmetic is because I was not a GroupMuse attendant before COVID, but at $10 a pop to generate $325 per, let's even say just a duo, but that's like 60 people. Yeah,
you would need a big house to
That's a huge house.
Right. Mm-hmm.
From my understanding of it, just people that have done GroupMuse tend to be kind of the maybe early, kind of like just out of school or maybe even still in school as part of like a supplemental income of doing house concerts to supplement their income. So it's encouraging to see that, those people that are not salaried musicians of an orchestra that haven't been furloughed yet. These people are dependent on that income right now to make ends meet. So it's great. It's great to see that there's at least something for them.
In the same way that I think, musicians in other genres, how many house bands, are out there trying to make ends meet. Like this is very much the classical music aesthetic of the same idea. And I think that should be supported, COVID or no.
All right, great. Well, thanks so much, Tiffany. And once again, we'll be sure that there's a link in our show notes to GroupMuse. I wanted to bring a project by a friend of mine who lives in Portland, Oregon. Her name is Arwen Myers. She's a soprano. I definitely wanted to make sure that we had some vocal music represented in this format because vocal music has been particularly hit, I think, in the COVID era, even more than instrumental music. It's not great for instrumentalists out there, but you can get a string quartet together and play out on your stoop or something like that. But, for vocalists and particularly for choral musicians, we've had a really rough time. It hit my community here in Seattle particularly hard. Early in the pandemic, there was a community choir where there was a big COVID outbreak connected to a rehearsal, and 2 members of that choir ended up dying. And so that was a very early lesson in COVID transmission and the deadliness that we did not want to learn that way. So I was really impressed with what Arwen has done. The project that I'm talking about is actually sort of 2 interrelated projects. Very early in the pandemic, she reached out to 10 composer friends of hers, and she commissioned 10 short works for solo voice or voice with a simple piano part that she could play. She's not a pianist, but she can accompany herself to some degree. And she did a live streamed concert on Artslandia's Facebook page. So, and again, this is like right off the bat, she's doing something very interesting and innovative. She's connecting composers to her project, to this larger arts organization in Oregon. So that was really cool. And then in mid-July, she participated in this larger project called Pavement, which was one of these drive-in concerts in a parking lot. So people could buy a ticket, they would drive in their cars, they would park in the parking lot, and then they would listen to this concert. But it was not just a concert. It was not just a classical music thing. It was a big collaboration of many different arts disciplines and organizations, theatrical performances involved. There was spoken word. So it was a big melange of different media and genres. And Arwen was one of the people there, and she chose some of these composer works that she had commissioned early in the pandemic.
Well, I'm curious if when pandemic hit and I was thinking about creative ways to tackle it, I thought, commissioning is such an obvious example right now. Like if we're living in this, milieu of music that it was not meant to be performed the way we now have to perform music, shouldn't the time and also the bandwidth kind of be ripe for commissioning or creating new projects that are suited to the moment?
Yeah, of course, it's a complicated issue because especially right at the beginning of the pandemic, there were a lot of people who were just in a fog. They didn't know what to do. They were not feeling particularly creative. They were feeling depressed. And for me, I would say that it has been a boon to my life as a composer to have all of this time and space. This has been a very prolific period by my normal standards. From my other perspective, as a music director of an organization, I have commissioned at least 6 or 7 pieces. Some of those will be premiering online, and it will be making recordings of, but some of them are very much intended for when we come back that we'll hit the ground running and we'll have all this great new interesting music to do.
I just wanted to add that one thing that I find really encouraging about this is that this kind of performance where it's very interdisciplinary and multiple performing arts organizations or arts organizations are teaming up together, especially when resources are tight. I think this kind of attitude hopefully will carry through after the pandemic, because I think some people tend to be kind of protective over their own resources and the sharing of it and the sharing of performance spaces with other arts organizations in the area, I think is really wonderful to see.
All right. Well, it really has been nice hearing about these examples of success stories in the time of COVID. But, there's only so much that the 3 of us can be aware of, that we can cover, and that we can bring to this particular segment. So this would be a great opportunity for our listeners to write in to classicalgabfest@gmail.com. Let us know what's going on in your area with your friends, things that you've seen online that you would like us to spotlight in a future episode, and we would be really happy to do so. And with that, it's time for our next topic. Kensho, what do you have for us?
Over the coming weeks and months, my GabFest co-hosts and I are delving into the latest book by The New Yorker's classical music critic Alex Ross. Wagnerism is Ross's 3rd book after the widely successful The Rest is Noise and Listen to This. At a whopping 660 pages, it's a deep dive into the influence that Richard Wagner's life and art wrought upon the world, truly unlike that of any composer before or after him. This week, we're discussing the intro and the first 2 chapters, Rheingold and the Tristan chord. All right, so to start this discussion, why don't we go around the horn and ask, basically what are our kind of previous experiences with Wagner? What do we think about Wagner? What do we think about his music? Before kind of delving into this huge tome of a book.
Yeah, I would say that I don't qualify as a Wagner aficionado. And I will be upfront with that. Not particularly because of any inclination or disinclination towards his music. In fact, what I do know of his, I quite like. But, in terms of capturing my emotional imagination, my heart lies elsewhere. It is interesting the way that it's presented to us with this book, which implies that, you ought to know at least a little bit about Wagner, which I know enough to get around to be able to understand even just the title of the book, which is Wagnerism. And Alex spends a fair amount of time with the introduction assuring us that, in fact, we need not, know the ins and outs of the entire ring cycle or exactly why Tristan and Isolde is so revolutionary in a harmonic sense, right, to be able to appreciate, because what he does very deliberately describe this book as is a story about how a musician influenced non-musicians. And so coming at it from, different intellectual spheres is actually, I think, a fantastically compelling way to approach the subject.
I am a Wagner lover, and my love of Wagner's music has been deepened tremendously in the past 10 years, I would say. My relationship with Wagner's music underwent a profound change when I read a different book about Wagner, a book called The Tristan Chord by an English philosopher named Brian McGee. And I often tell people that that is my all-time favorite book about music, bar none. I have recommended that more than any other book. That book delves into the question of what does music mean and what can music tell us on a philosophical level. So for that reason, my priors with Wagner are A, that I have really come to love his music, and B, that I have a very high bar to clear for books about Wagner and Wagner's music. So that is definitely coloring my reading of this book. What about you, Kensho?
It's interesting. It's kind of a mix of both of your experiences in that, one, I don't feel like I know Wagner very well. Yet over the last even 3 or 5 years, I would say 3 to 5 years, I've developed more of an appreciation for it. So I was definitely the instrumentalist that, played a little bit of Wagner. Flying Dutchman Overture is another one that comes up a lot in kind of the youth orchestra, or at least the conservatory level orchestra. And I've conducted a little bit. And while I don't have a strong, love for that music, but I do enjoy playing it to a certain extent. So I never kind of sought out to learn more about Wagner outside of just my direct experiences of playing his music. So for me, I was kind of lukewarm on Wagner until I went to the Metropolitan Opera's production of Parsifal that Yannick Nézis again conducted, I think about 2 years ago. And that's a long song. And I was mesmerized from the beginning to the end, and was just kind of in love with that kind of cosmic world that Wagner, created within that sound. And to me, that was when it kind of started to open my eyes. Okay, so there is something special going on with this music that was not necessarily something that I was tapping into when I was younger. So that's where I'm coming from in terms of my experience with Wagner and how I am approaching reading this book. So with that in mind, let's talk about the intro and the first 2 chapters. What are our kind of general thoughts and reactions?
So I guess the thing to start with this book is just to say what it is that we read. I mean, the prelude starts with the death of Richard Wagner. And maybe that's an important thing to say, is that this is not a book about Wagner himself or even really his music. This is a book about the after effects of the cult of Wagner and how that has gone forth through the past 150 years. So that's where the prelude starts. And then there's a chapter called Rheingold, which is the name of the quote-unquote prelude opera to the Ring of the Nibelung tetralogy. By any other composer's standards, Rheingold coming in at about 2 hours would be a full-length opera, but for Wagner, he calls that the prelude evening, the Vorabend of the cycle. And so that first chapter is really about how Wagner built his brand and how he started to attract adherents in Germany. And the focus is really on Nietzsche, the famous German philosopher, gets a lot of airtime in that chapter. The second chapter that we read is called the Tristan Chord, and there Alex Ross fleshes out a little bit more of Wagner's history, but the focus switches from Germany to France and talks about how there was a big flowering of French Wagnerites, le Wagnerisme, and there's a big focus on what we would consider a symbolist poet, Baudelaire. So that's just to set people up for what we're actually going to be talking about, what we actually read today.
Yeah, and it's worthwhile to note also that in the same way that that we're not telling the story of Wagner's life and that we start with his death, in fact, that the history is not chronological, which I find quite refreshing. And so let's take a look at the names of some of the other chapters, which are like Victorian Britain. So in chapter 3 migrates over across the strait. Chapter 6 and 7 Jewish and Black Wagner, and chapter 7 feminist and gay Wagner. So I think that the approach here is the tracing of Wagner's threads in all their multiplicities, and that is an important theme of the book. Was that this is not something that you can reduce to a single narrative, which is sort of the threat that we face when we talk about Wagner's music in order to be sensitive to his known anti-Semitism and these kinds of things. I think my overwhelming impression reading the first 2 chapters and understanding, first of all, how shallow my current knowledge of German philosophers is, but you trace the threads of Wagner's philosophy and music into all these different spheres and how they become contorted or just transformed into different religions and philosophies and arts, and it's really quite an interesting and cool approach.
Well, okay. Well, I'll start with one of my biggest takeaways. I was not aware as to the extent of how influential Wagner was, not just with his music, but with his writings. I knew that he had some connections to philosophers and like this, but I think that the fact that he participated in the kind of literary discourse throughout the history, I think was really an eye-opener for me.
Yeah, not just literary, but political, right? And so we spend a long time kind of talking about his intellectualism in certain spheres and understanding, he thought this thing, and therefore he tried to represent that in his art. And that's such a romantic notion. Romantic in the sense that it's in a Eurocentrically romantic option anyway. So a single man decides that there's a higher ideal towards which he's working. And all of his work after that is devoted to that singular mission of trying to realize whatever that conviction is. From the music itself to the devising of the staging and the architecture at Bayreuth and all these things. And it's really quite cool that you can find something that transcends genre in terms of ideals.
Yeah, to me, the best example of Wagner, of theory compelling the pure will of somebody to do something, is the fact that Wagner started writing the Ring cycle. He wrote 2 2/3 of it, like the Rheingold, then all of Walküre, 2 acts of Siegfried. He got that far in 1857. Put down his pen, decided that he needed to write some bangers, some big hits to generate cash, then wrote Tristan und Isolde and Der Meistersinger, which, as a composer, when I think that I need to write something to generate a little cash, I write a string orchestra piece. I don't write 2 other 4-hour-long operas, but that's what Wagner did. But anyway, he goes away and he writes those, and then he comes back 12 years later, 1869, picks up his pen exactly where he left off and finishes writing Siegfried and then writes Götterdämmerung. So if that's not a man possessed by, you would have to have some greater ambition than just, I like to write operas. You're not going to see Rossini stop in the middle of William Tell, and then pick it up 12 years later and say I've got to go forward with this. This is my life's work. It just wouldn't happen.
And here we are still waiting for the newest Game of Thrones book. It's not
right.
Still not.
Well, and it's really interesting that you bring up Game of Thrones because that's something that Alex Ross even talks about. He says, look, you can't ignore Wagnerism, whether you like him and his music or not, because it redounds through the decades. And if you look at The Lord of the Rings, if you look at Game of Thrones, all these could not have existed without Wagner and the Ring cycle in particular?
I want to talk about what you said earlier, Will, about Wagner the brand, because I think that's really super interesting, the way he was kind of figuring out Bayreuth. And it's actually kind of the start of the split between Nietzsche and Wagner, too, is when Nietzsche was kind of, observing Wagner make these deals and try to kind of, promote his music or in a very kind of capitalist way.
Well, we should talk about exactly what we mean by making Bayreuth.
Oh, I don't know if I can describe it.
Well, Bayreuth is a small town in Bavaria where Wagner decided to build his own opera house with specific things in mind to present this very over-the-top theatrical, all-encompassing, engrossing experience. So when we refer to Bayreuth, that's sort of shorthand for the Festspielhaus, the festival playhouse that Wagner actually commissioned the blueprints for and the architecture of, and then had built with the financial assistance of a certain King Ludwig II of Bavaria, who was like 18 years old and was like literally in love with him. That's a whole different story. But anyway, sorry, I derailed you, Kensho. What were you saying?
No, but it's interesting, like how we kind of read so much about the relationship between Nietzsche and Wagner, and this is kind of the start of the split between the two of them when all of these kind of deals are happening with Wagner, and he's starting to kind of talk about how ornate the decoration of the hall should be and all of this that doesn't have to do very much with the content of the art itself. And this is kind of our start. This starts the split of that Nietzsche-Wagner connection in a way.
Yeah, and I think that there's two things I want to mention. One was that actually Wagner wasn't that into making Bayreuth extremely ornate or having these kinds of pretenses of class. Like, that wasn't what he was trying to do. It was Ludwig, in fact, Ludwig II, who wanted it to be more
fancy. Ludwig was very much into fancy. He wanted sparkles and glitter everywhere.
Yeah. And Wagner, they ended up reaching sort of a compromise in terms of what Bayreuth, the architecture and trappings became. But what that didn't prevent from happening was this celebrity cult status and commercialization of Wagner's name that I think is often a source of conflict for artists who are driven by a mission, and then that mission becomes successful, and they're like, wait, now what? Because so much of the origination of their mission came from this struggle of not being successful or not being heard or not having the right stage. So we see that all the time now. And when people reach viral success and they're looking at their own successes like, is that really me? Like, this, what happened to me? And I think that the nature of Wagner's kind of overt disagreement with some of Nietzsche's philosophies and also the missing of the relationship that they had prior to the construction of Bayreuth is very much related to the celebrity conflict that happens.
And then it seems like it's like rinse and repeat after that too, right? With the following, Baudelaire and all the other people that come along in his life, in and out, kind of paying respect to the master and then having a disagreement and then leaving. It's just rinse and repeat with Wagner.
Yeah, and Kensho, it's funny when you're talking about Nietzsche. I mean, who was another young man who was very compelled by and attracted to Wagner. I mean, he was 24 years old, was just at the start of an academic career, and Wagner saw how that could be of use to him to have somebody on the inside of academia, sort of espousing his ideas and propelling them forward. But then the fact that they had this rift, and Nietzsche renounced Wagner, and Alex Ross says that that this apostasy, this rejection of Wagner is anti-Wagnerism, and that there's no escaping Wagner. You have to have a take one way or the other. You have to weigh in on what your feeling is about him, especially in the 19th century. And I think it was Nietzsche who said, you can't become modern without Wagner.
Yeah, there's another, I think, apt description of their relationship at the end of the chapter when Alex describes their relationship as more of competitors, like athletic competitors trying to best each other. They need each other in order to reach the heights that they reached or the depths that they reached, and depending on which point of view you're looking at it. But they relied on each other in a certain sense. It wasn't that they were just trying to annihilate each other or that anti-Wagnerism was even really anti-Wagnerism. It was a response, So in the same way, you're always marching forward. You need something to galvanize whatever your movement is. Otherwise, neither of you would exist.
Well, Tiffany, you said early on that this book sort of showed like that you had maybe a somewhat shallow understanding of like German philosophers in general, and this is a very literate book. I do think that you are better armed to go into this reading experience if you know at least a moderate amount about Nietzsche and Baudelaire and some of these painters and musicians that Alex Ross is talking about. So, it is a heady read for that. I have to say, I was glad that you also listed the chapters in the middle of the book because, when Alex Ross says that there's a socialist Wagner and a feminist Wagner and a gay Wagner and a black Wagner and a satanic Wagner, that is much more what I'm looking forward to. This sort of table setting in these first two chapters was fine and everything, but I really can't wait to hear what he has to say about all that stuff.
Well, and I'm excited to read those chapters as well, but without the background on what Wagner kind of is in the pop imagination, or even in just the semi-literate classical musician's imagination, those chapters would feel rudderless to me as well. So I'm happy to have the table setting, as you say.
Well, there is much, much more to discuss as we progress through this book, and very much interested in the next discussion about these middle chapters coming up. So stay tuned for more on the Classical Gabfest Book Club. That brings us to our third topic of the week. Tiffany, what do you have for us?
This summer, amidst the swell of the Black Lives Matter movement and its corresponding reverberations across all facets of our society, New York Times music critic and correspondent Anthony Tomasini wrote this doozy of an article: To make orchestras more diverse, end blind auditions. Tomasini writes that American orchestras remain among the nation's least racially diverse institutions, especially in regard to Black and Latino artists. Today in New York City, which is a city that is a quarter Black, just 1 out of 106 full-time players is Black, Anthony McGill, the principal clarinet. Obviously, Tomasini argues, the status quo is not working, and he fingers blind auditions as part of the problem. Now, I'll leave it to the main body of this segment to get into how this argument is laid out, but by way of exposition, a blind audition is a hiring practice common in orchestras by which musicians are invited to do a live audition, and they do all of their actual playing behind a black screen that visually obscures and thus anonymizes them so that they can be judged purely on the merit of the sounds that they're producing. This practice was first implemented precisely because visual biases, particularly against gender, were so dramatically alleviated, and the gender parity in orchestras improved dramatically almost overnight once this practice was implemented. To present the various arguments to you, our listeners, in an interesting way, we are going to have a mock debate here on the Gabfest. Will White will take the position that orchestras should adopt a completely blind process in their auditions. Kensho will argue for the end of blind auditions altogether. We'll have 3 brief rounds of arguments with 90-second opening statements, starting with Will. The rebuttal round allows each of them to respond for 1.5 minutes each to elements in the opening statements without adding new information. 1-minute closing statements will follow, and I will also say that the participants are not allowed to interrupt each other during their arguments. For anyone not aware of how debates work, the positions that Kensho and Will are taking up are deliberately binary, and the things that they are arguing are not necessarily representative of their actual views on the issue, which we'll discuss afterwards. And for anyone who does know how debates work, well, forgive us, we're not really following standard tournament rules here. So we have 1.5 minutes on the clock here, and I'll cede the stage to Will for our opening statement.
Music is a sonic medium. What matters most to a musician's job performance is the sound that they make, either on their instrument or with their voice. Ergo, the people who are in a position to judge and hire new candidates for a professional ensemble should use their ears alone to decide who is qualified to win a position. A fully screened audition process is the great equalizer. As the world of professional classical music is currently constituted, the institutional gatekeepers are overwhelmingly white and male, and they skew older. These people have been acculturated in a society that has inculcated them with all sorts of unconscious biases. When screens come down and visual cues are added, it is unavoidable that even the most socially conscious judge will rely on these biases, and that can lead to negative impacts for candidates who are people of color and people who are members of visually evident minorities. It can even lead to negative outcomes for less conventionally attractive members within a given racial group. Many entrenched orchestral musicians and administrators talk about the potential loss of quality their ensembles might suffer by letting in musicians who come from non-traditional backgrounds or who are selected for because of other criteria. many of these same musicians joined these ensembles by starting out as substitute players who were advanced past the screened rounds of the audition process. Their path to the big leagues was aided by personal connections and luck of the draw. If they want to put their words into action, why not make a system that is fair and impartial to all who participate?
Kensho, the stage is yours.
Blind auditions were implemented in 1970 in response to a lawsuit filed by 2 black musicians against the New York Philharmonic, arguing that they were rejected for positions within the orchestra based on their race. At the time, orchestras across the United States had virtually no Black or Latinx members, and women made up less than 6% of the musician complement. Half a century later, while women make up as much as 50% of some major orchestras, Black and Latinx members only make up 1.8 and 2.5% of orchestra membership, respectively. Blind auditions have failed to address the issue of diversity on the stages of orchestras. Orchestral performance is an oral experience that is witnessed. Diversity represented on stage is one of the many essential components of institutional relevance in the community. Many BIPOC musicians with positions in orchestras point to the experience of seeing someone who looks like them on stage as inspiration for pursuing their career. The ecosystem of an orchestra is extremely fluid and volatile for reasons that at times have nothing to do with the musician's talent. The returns on an individual's personality, empathy, citizenship, and willingness to engage their community bring more value to the relevance of a performing arts institution. These attributes of a musician are never seen or heard in a blind audition, resulting in an incomplete assessment of the applicant. Diversity data of conservatories point to 5 to 8% of their students as Black or Latinx, between 2 and 3 times the percentage of their professional counterparts. Organizations such as the Sphinx organization have dispelled the notion that there is a dearth of talent in the BIPOC community. As orchestras strive to better reflect the diversity of their community, ending blind auditions is a necessary part of building a better hiring practice.
Will, the stage is yours.
Well, first I'd like to say that I agree with Kensho and the Sphinx organization in saying that there is certainly no dearth of talent among BIPOC and other underrepresented communities. And for that reason, I think that they should have as fair a shot as anybody else when they go into an audition. And when you take down the screens, the fact of the matter is that they do not have the same shot as other people who are up for those same positions. As for this idea of weighting other qualities that a musician might bring to their candidacy, such as team playership or community outreach. These are just more opportunities for committees to rule people out based on things that they might not like. It gives them more opportunities to point to other elements of job performance where they could say, oh, well, this person, I don't think that they're going to fit into our culture here, or I don't think they're going to be a team player. And you know what? As Kensho said, you don't hear any of those things on the stage, so why should they matter? And finally, I would just say that Kensho says that blind auditions were instituted in 1970, but the fact of the matter is that we've never actually had truly blind auditions. What's been going on for the past 50 years has been a hybrid model. So musicians come on stage, they are behind a screen for the first couple of rounds, and then in the final round, they play not behind a screen. So we can't really point to the blind audition as much as we might like to, because we've never had it in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Kensho, the stage is yours.
Will, you just said that certain qualities of a person's musicianship or citizenship even you don't hear that on stage. Well, you also don't hear different audience compositions. In a time where we're talking about we need to attract different diversity of audiences, those audiences won't be changed unless we change the composition of the musicians on stage. So one of the biggest barriers of entry for auditions is the fact that there's a high cost of travel and application fee sometimes to get into a preliminary round of an audition. And one of the ways that people do develop a way to advance or to be more successful in auditions is to take more auditions or to progress in more rounds so that they have more time in which to present how they play. And when push comes to shove, a lot of these musicians face basically sometimes they're short 1 vote or 1 point, whatever the system is, to progress to the next round. And I think that with all things being even, if a committee sees that there is a BIPOC musician right there on that cusp, that they may want to, in terms of just not even the end result of hiring, but to encourage this person to continue these auditions and have that welcoming space of an audition, to let that person play another round to have a fair shot. The other point that I want to address is about implicit bias. That Will assumes that there's no implicit bias just by listening. there's tons of implicit bias just by listening behind a screen based on styles that people like hearing, the kind of sound that people produce. Maybe they even recognize a student or somebody, a colleague that have played for them beforehand, that now they recognize they're playing even behind a screen, and will be able to vote for them, knowing that that person is the player that is behind the screen. So the blind auditions is definitely not a perfect system already in place that would eliminate any kind of bias.
Well, I would sum up by saying that if you talk to BIPOC musicians themselves, and here I am pointing to a podcast appearance by a Black oboist named Titus Underwood. They are pushing for fully blind audition processes. You know, Titus says that the only major audition that he's ever won was the only one that was completely blind. So I think that the implicit biases from visual cues are very real, and I think that we need to move to this system where we have totally blind auditions and we choose people based on the content and the quality of their playing and not any other cues that we might pick up from seeing them.
Kensho, the stage is yours for the closing.
I will conclude by just saying this, that orchestral musicians hope to receive tenure after they've won an audition. And with that, they will have earned an incredible amount of security for themselves and their families. And it also represents a profound commitment by the orchestra in that individual, as tenure in most cases means a career-long commitment. Are we willing to award a potentially life-term position based on a completely blind audition, without any other access to information about the other attributes of a musician?
Good job, guys. Well argued. So, having gone through that, what do you actually think?
Well, as someone that definitely does not believe what I was arguing, this was kind of tough to really take a hard stance, but I did my best. I mean, I think that, you know, as Will says quite often in this podcast, the devil's in the details, and that we really do need to examine having a blind audition, but also creating more opportunities for BIPOC musicians to have access to the plethora of steps that are leading up to taking an orchestral audition. We're talking about the cost of instruments, the cost of lessons, the cost of going to schools, and there's so many other levels that we need to address before even the orchestral audition system to ensure that there's diversity on the stage.
Yeah, and it's not like, as you've also acknowledged a number of times on this podcast, it's not like the auditioning orchestra can be in charge of all of that. It's not down to a single institution or a single practice. But what about you, Will? Did you agree with what you were saying?
I agreed with some of it, but I more so agree with Kensho's like get real moment here when saying that like when we're talking about what happens at the actual audition, we're talking about like a stage way too late in the game. We need to be talking about like how are resumes processed, like how is music education distributed in public and private school systems. You know, what are recruitment efforts like for conservatories and schools of music? So, Tiffany, I have a question for you. Based on the binary arguments presented, were you convinced on either side? I'm not asking for a winner, but I'm just, you know, was there one side of this that was more convincing to you? And then what are your feelings about, like, you know, what's your take outside of that binary spectrum?
I will say that I find the argument for completely blind pretty compelling if I had to choose one or the other. Even with this idea that with more affirmative policies in place that you are able to look for people of color or different backgrounds. For me, that just doesn't speak to the principles that I want to be at the heart of my work. And that may seem gatekeepery, you know, on some level, but I do think that the search for something musical that transcends whatever our identity is does unite folks from different backgrounds. And I phrase this slowly and gingerly, knowing that it may not fully acknowledge the types of backgrounds that different kinds of people who are trying to get into this field come from. And that's something of which I'm aware. As for my own take, I mean, I recognize the difficulty that institutions who are looking at fields of hundreds of qualified candidates are in. And this strikes me with any interview process for any job in any field. You cannot make that interview process resemble the actual job in a really substantive, robust way. which is the key for me. I mean, like the fact that an audition is at most a few weeks, or maybe sometimes if you're going to go really hardcore, a year, it's still not going to, predict how this person is going to act over the course of a 20-year career if you give them tenure, like Kensho was saying. So with the acknowledgement of that, I mean, this sort of, as much as we can get to making the process, even just like the application process where it feels hopeless, the odds feel hopeless, as close as you can get to making that feel humane, I think would go a really long way. I mean, take away application fees and give people options for staying somewhere when they audition somewhere. I mean, and it's hard. I mean, you're strapped for cash. Of course, you're going to want to save everything that you can. But I think making just the initial process of an audition application more humane would go a really long way for me. That's, I think, the note that we'll end on. This is a really complex topic, and a lot, maybe with more complexity than some of our listeners may have realized before. And also, I bet that a couple of you out there have gone through this process. And so we'd like to hear from you and know what you think in your experiences would make the process more, as I say, humane, or maybe, examples of successes that how you've been treating in auditions. We want to hear about all of those things. So thanks to our debate contestants, Kensho and Will. Great job, arguments. And we'll go on to our classical mixtape segment.
In our classical mixtape, we each recommend some music that's caught our ear this week to share with our listeners. So, Kensho, what do you have this week?
All right, so I am now, it's in crunch time for wedding-related music, and I don't know, this is a question for both of you. It's kind of out of the norm of classical mixtape, but I've always associated wedding music with string quartet music, or just like string ensemble music. I've never imagined like a piano, or even the harp seems a little cliche to me. Like I've always looked for like a string ensemble piece for wedding music. Is that the case for you guys, or do you have a different take?
Well, I think that string quartets are very traditionally played, even in these times when so much traditional classical and church music has been stripped from weddings. You still you hire a string quartet, they come in, they play Beatles songs, and everybody's happy.
But I think one thing that is maybe, and if I may get kind of armchair philosophical for a second, like the string has had the ability to kind of blend or come forward in a way that, like, just imagine trying to have a wind quintet play at your wedding. Like, wouldn't you have no choice but to be looking at the wind quintet when they're playing? Like, do you have any choice but to pay attention to that, orally speaking?
Right. And maybe that's what I'm getting at. So, I mean, no shade over to our wind playing friends, but that's kind of how I feel. So I've been kind of going down the string quartet hole, and I found this great little ditty by a 15-year-old Franz Schubert. The title is simply Andante in C major, and it was a piece that existed basically as a fragment in the string quartet version, and then appeared later, probably written at the same time, but just appeared later as a piano piece incomplete. So basically the fragment was then extrapolated into the string quartet version, which is what I bring to you today. So it is a viable candidate for maybe some prelude music. And this is a recording by the Diogenes Quartet.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Kensho. And of course, another teaser to our listeners that we will reveal what Kensho ended up choosing for his wedding on a future segment. Tiffany, what do you have for us today?
So I went a little bit off of my standard modus operandi for this recommendation, and it's just something that I heard on the radio last week. This is Faure's Piano Quartet No. 1 in C minor, and I'm going to recommend the third movement. I never thought that I was really a Faure fan. I think a lot of his things are like a little on the simple side and sometimes bordering on trite. But I really glommed onto this piece, and it reminded me of the way that I feel, or, I mean, it hasn't happened, too much in recent years, but like the way that I feel when I hear a Brahms piece that I haven't heard before. And that's a feeling that I remember very distinctly after I became a fan of Brahms, but I, knew all the symphonies and so on. And then I stumbled upon a piece that I hadn't previously known, and I didn't even know that it was Brahms at first. And then I realized that it was, and I was like, oh yeah, my fandomness is confirmed. So I felt a little bit like that listening to this third movement, which I think is easily the most most soulful and Brahmsian, if you'll excuse the adjective, of the piece. This is a recording by the Schubert Ensemble.
Yeah, Tiffany, I was thinking when I was listening to this, first of all, it's like you put a knife through my heart by saying that you're not a Faure fan. I mean, Faure is just such an amazing composer. But second of all, I was thinking, it's funny that you talk so much about Brahms. Like, if we were ever to do a Two Truths and a Lie or a Game of Pairs about Brahms, this would be the perfect fake-out piece. You know, it is about as much Brahms sounding as something could sound without actually being by Brahms.
Yeah, it's really incredibly songful. And I have to admit, I hadn't known it previously. So for people who are like me out there, who for whatever reason have never come across this piece where I had the honor to play it, it's on my bucket list for sure now.
Well, thank you, Tiffany. My recommendation for this week is going to be a little shout out to my choral friends, once again, we who are suffering so acutely during this time. This is a movement from Brahms's Ein Deutsches Requiem, the German Requiem. The movement that I have chosen is Denn alles Fleisch, es ist wie Gras. And this came to my attention this week for two reasons. One is that there was a post by the great orchestra, the HR Symphony Orchestra, better known in English-speaking world as the Frankfurt Radio Symphony, which I think has sort of quietly become one of the world's great orchestras over the past 10 or 15 years without anybody paying attention to it. The chorus here is the MDR Rundfunkchor, and the performance is conducted by David Zinman. So this was it's something they posted. This is a recording of theirs from 2019. The other funny thing, why I chose this movement in particular, first of all, it's just because it's an extremely powerful moment in the Requiem and in this performance. But secondly, because there's a Swedish church musician who I follow on Instagram, and he posted recently a picture of some field, right? And then he posted something in Swedish. Well, I don't speak Swedish, so I just clicked the translate this caption, button on Instagram. And apparently he was quoting this movement, which is a text from the Psalms. So the German is Denn alles Fleisch, es ist wie Gras. The English would be for all flesh is as grass. So the idea is about mortality. Everything comes and goes. All flesh is as grass. It has a very poetic sound to it. And that was the quote. But when it was translated, auto-translated on Instagram from the Swedish, it came up as all meat is hay. That was amazing.
To all vegans everywhere. I love
right, exactly.
that.
And as a vegan, I was like, oh boy, what do I say about that? But anyway, so this is the all meat is hay movement from Brahms's German Requiem. All right, well, you will find links to all of these and to our full classical mixtape playlist in the show notes.
And with that, it's time to wrap up this episode of the Classical Gabfest. I'm Kensho Watanabe, and on behalf of Tiffany Liu and William White, I'd like to thank you so much for listening and to encourage you to subscribe and rate us on Apple Podcasts. We'd also love your help spreading the word about our show on social media, where you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can reach us at classicalgabfest@gmail.com, and we'd love to hear from you. Until next time, happy listening, and we'll be with you next week.